The head of NATO said that they will continue to support Ukraine and that Ukraine's future is definitely in NATO. Is there any truth to this, or is this a giant dangling carrot to keep Ukraine fighting?
First of all, I don't think the Ukrainians are interested in dying anymore. I think it's going to be tougher and tougher to keep them in the fight, so to say. They already have a very powerful force with the SBU, the Ukrainian Secret Police, and they do execute people and they do imprison people and torture people. And they are going to do everything in their power to keep these Ukrainians in line. They keep the squads of Ukrainians small. They don't allow groups of more than 3 or 4 Ukrainian men to get together. If you have a platoon and a company all at once marching into the front line, there's always the danger of a rebellion. They don't want a rebellion. So they feed in new troops in small numbers. So is this going to keep them into the war? And that's why we say it. No, I think we say it and we will continue to say it because people just don't want to be exposed. They've been pushing very bad policy with terrible consequences for us, for Europe, for Ukraine. And it's failing. And what do you do when you have no choice and everything is failing? If the truth is ugly, a lie is beautiful. You know, how many people were standing on the outskirts of Berlin, you know, sort of demented Nazis who thought, gee, we're still going to win the war until the Soviets finally entered East Berlin and we came in from the West. There were people like that. You know, that movie Downfall is very instructive because in the movie, towards the end, when Hitler goes in to shoot himself, as he turns to open the door and go in and commit suicide, one of the women standing in the hallway who was working in the bunker says, "But mein Führer, what about the inevitable victory?" I mean, this is, you have a combination of ideologues who are deceitful and dishonest. And on the other hand, you've got a lot of people who want to believe something and they can't quite wrap their minds around the truth that what they've been told is a lie.
Yeah.
I think the American people fall into that category.
Yeah. Do you think the CIA is accurately assessing the strength of Russia and their growing army and then lying about it in the presidential briefing? Or do you think that they really believe that Russia is weak and easily toppled? Like I'm trying to get like beyond the propaganda and the paranoia.
Well, at lower levels, there are always analysts who do an excellent job, whether it's the CIA or DIA or NSA or anywhere else. I've seen this. And they put the analysis together and then they bring it to the next level, to probably to a lieutenant colonel. He says, "I don't know about this." "Well, what's wrong with that, sir?" "Well, I don't think the boss is going to like this." He said, "Let's run it by the director first before we go see the general." The director says, "Oh my God, I can't put this in front of the general. He'll go berserk." "Well, why?" "Because the people above the general, the appointed political officials, they don't want to hear that." And so this sort of thing goes on year after year after year. I was once worked briefly in the Office of Net Assessment back in 1986 in the summer. The Office of Net Assessment is a place where large-scale assessments of opposing forces are developed, or at least at that point where simulations are run, models were employed in order to do exactly what you said, to try and get a clear picture. And while I was there, I was asked to look over this assessment, and I was at the time working on my doctoral dissertation. And I said, well, from all the information I can see right now, of the non-Soviet forces in the Warsaw Pact, the only ones that might be reliable in the event of a collision with the United States are the East Germans. The Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, they're not really interested in fighting, and they'll probably not fight, or at least try not to fight if there's a war. Well, I was thanked for my interest in national defense. And there was none of that in the final analysis. No, that's not what we want to say. We were talking about justifying budgets, massive outlays for defense, for all sorts of equipment. But in truth, this thing called the Soviet mastodon, the great power of the world, was already on the skids. There were many people who recognized that. The question that everybody wanted to answer is, well, when does it fall apart? It's sort of like the proverbial black swan in economics and finance. People say, well, all right, I agree with you. The 10-year Treasury interest rates are rising. This is very dangerous. This means that all of the old treasuries that were bought years ago at very low interest rates are now liabilities, so-called unrealized losses. What are we going to do about those? Well, eventually got to get rid of them. They're worth nothing now. Well, how do you do that? Well, this is a difficult situation that we're now in. There are lots of banks in the United States confronting this problem. It's a problem overseas and around the world. It's the same thing. Well, did anybody step forward and say, this might not be a good idea. We might want to sell these off now and shift our interest-bearing money into other markets and other things? I'm sure they did. But it wasn't welcome news. There's a book by John Kenneth Galbraith. He talks about financial crises, his history of financial crises. He says this, you have people at the top who are not there because they've demonstrated remarkable character. They're there because they went along. And they're fine until there's a real crisis.
Yeah.
And then they all have to go away because they can't cope. We see that in the banking system. We see it in finance. We see it in the military. We see it in politics. I think that's where we're headed right now. I can't predict which day, which week, but I think things are going to get pretty dicey here.
Yeah.
And I think Americans sense it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think they're feeling it. Like you say, the pain train is on the move, and they're starting to feel it in different areas, whether it's, hey, who are all these people showing up? Or, man, I can't afford the groceries that I used to. Or, great, now interest rates are above 5%. I've got no money to earn any interest on.
Well, it's very interesting when you look at something like illegal immigration. People are now becoming, finally, after all these years, much more sensitive to it than I can remember for 2 decades. And the official number of illegals inside the United States, it's the consensus number. That's what people tell you in the mainstream media is, well, there's 7 million, maybe 8. Well, that's all nonsense. All you have to do is cloister yourself privately with people in Homeland Security, talk to people down the Border Patrol, talk to people in Washington who are involved on the periphery of these things. They'll tell you, well, there are probably 28 million in here. But do we really know? It may be more. The truth is, we don't know. But you throw out a number like that, and everybody's, oh, well, that's outrageous. That can't possibly be. Well, I've got news for you. There's a reason the mayors of, as you pointed out, in Chicago and New York City are saying, I need tens of millions of dollars to house all of these so-called migrants. Americans are also saying, well, while you're trying to do that, where are you going to put them to work? Who's going to employ these people? And if we were to have a significant recession or even depression, then matters are much worse because we've taken on this additional responsibility that we can't handle. And Americans are not going to be favorably disposed to the government that is spending enormous sums of money on people who are not citizens. So this is not a good thing. I mean, people say, well, they're not a big burden. Well, we have 27 million people roughly that we think are without health insurance. Maybe it's more. I don't know. How many people coming into the country have health insurance? Well, we know the answer to that question. Well, then how do they get help if they need it? Well, they go to emergency rooms. And we don't turn people away. We have to treat them. But that's not cost-free. And those are the complaints that you're hearing now from the states, from cities. It's all finding its way back to Washington. But this is the sort of worst kind of irrational management. It's emotive. It's not founded on any logic that makes any sense. And that's the same thing with the Ukraine war. This was all an emotional response by the committed ideologues that hate Russia because it's an Orthodox Christian state with a Russian national identity that doesn't want to open its borders to anyone and allow anyone in. Well, that's why they hate Hungary. That's why the Poles are currently, receiving heat, and the Slovaks and others. These are societies where people have said, well, look at Germany. What a catastrophe. Look at Sweden. The Swedish prime minister is talking about using the army to try and regain control of Stockholm and other cities from the so-called, migrants or refugees that have been invited in. Well, this is a catastrophe. The rule of law is breaking down. And when that breaks down, your civilization is in severe trouble. I think that's where we are. And I think Putin is watching this from a distance. He and his advisors, I think they know that. Perhaps they're waiting for things to get worse before they finally move. I don't know. But at some point, they're going to have to come to the conclusion, I suspect, that no one is going to show up and negotiate much of anything, in which case they'll have to decide the issue the way they'd rather not, with military power.
Yeah. Yeah. Couple more questions, then I'll let you move on with your day.
I'm sorry for ranting and raving today.
No,
I'm a little depressed by where we're headed.
hey, I feel it every day. My wife's like, "How do you read this every day and not get depressed?" I was like, "Well, I just, you see that corner right there? I'll just go suck my thumb in that corner for a minute." But okay, coming back home to the United States. I know the military tries to stay apolitical because at any given time they could have a commander in chief that's a Democrat or a Republican. Do you think General Milley's swipe at Trump, calling him a wannabe dictator, do you think that was political or personal?
General Milley is probably, if not then certainly one of the most politicized figures in uniform I've seen in a long time. Of course, that's also true for Petraeus and most of the senior officers. The senior ranks in this country have always been somewhat politicized. FDR was very unhappy with the Army and the Army Air Corps. And one of the reasons he's very unhappy dealing with it was that he knew all the generals were Republicans. They were anti-New Dealers. And he was really pleasantly surprised when he discovered that an opposing Republican named George Marshall actually was fiercely loyal to the state and to him. And I think that we were that way, despite our political preferences and affiliations, for a long time. That began to break down in Vietnam. I think it really broke down dramatically with LBJ. If you look at Johnson, every time he tries to make a pronouncement about the war in Vietnam, he drags in a 4-star, General Earl Wheeler, Chief of Staff of the Army, then subsequently Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or General Westmoreland. These people show up with all these ribbons on their uniforms, some of which are meaningful, but most of which are not. But people don't know that. A lot of those are thank you for coming medals, or as my friends in the Marines start pointing, say, that's cruise number 2 to the Pacific, cruise number 3, and so forth. But people love these brass buttons and medals, and they see these generals, and the general smiles and says, "Yes, I'm confident that we can achieve our aims within the time frame given, provided we have the resources we've asked for. Thank you, Mr. President." I mean, how many times do you hear that stuff? Well, they have no business being there. They shouldn't have been there. LBJ was leaning on these people. And just about everybody since LBJ has repeated this over and over and over again. I was disappointed when President Trump did it. Don't drag these military men into anything. First of all, stop pretending that these are great men. None of them are George Patton or Eisenhower or MacArthur or anything else. They haven't done anything. Most of them never heard a shot fired in anger. Who are we kidding? So if you want to pay tribute to the real heroes of the last 20 years, go to Arlington. They're laid out there for you. Or look at all these poor people that you see from Wounded Warrior and other programs that have been terribly injured as a result. Those are the heroic figures that stayed the course. But Americans don't really understand these kinds of things. And I hope in the future, if he gets back into office, or it doesn't matter to me, whoever ultimately wins needs to put an end to this business of leaning for political support on generals and admirals. Forget it. It's wrong. When Marshall came over to testify, not all the time, but most of the time, he wore civilian clothes. And that was habitual. When General MacArthur was chief of staff, he showed up to testify in civilian clothes. They wore suits. You know why? because there was a feeling that if they came over in uniform with all their accoutrements and belts and everything else, that this would be intimidating to members, many of whom had never served. I thought that was bad form. So you had to come over there in a suit and make your case. That meant that you were very reliant on your own intelligence and ability to articulate the case on behalf of the United States Army or Navy. We've lost that. We now have a show every time something else. You see the State of the Union, or all my chiefs of staff there, lined up. This has got to stop. We are not a militarized country. This is not everybody says fascism, and Trump has got less in common with fascism than almost anybody I can think. He's a grandfather. If I were to criticize President Trump for anything based upon the time I saw him, say he's too damn nice, and should have fired large numbers of people instantly, and add to that the numbers of people he picked that were his enemies that actively subverted him. And I would say, again, I would go back to Eisenhower, who gave excellent advice to President Kennedy when he took over. JFK said to him, General, because he gave him back his rank after he was president, as General of the Army, he said, General, do you have any last bits of advice for me? And frankly, at that point, Eisenhower didn't think much of Kennedy. But he said, yes, I do. And he said, what's that? He said, be a good butcher. And JFK looked at him and said, well, what do you mean? He said, look, you're going to have to fire people if you expect anything to get done. Says people don't do what you tell them to do. When they don't, you got to get rid of them. People have to be held accountable. If they're not loyal, if they talk to the press, if they undermine you, get rid of them. End of discussion. That's how it has to be. Well, JFK didn't do that. And then he went through something called the Bay of Pigs. What a wonderful title. And he discovered just how many pigs he had. And then he began to take action. This is the lesson of history. Everybody talks about civilian control of the military. Well, it's not just civilian control, it's the control of anything, which is to impose accountability. If there's no accountability, there's no performance. Go back to our withdrawal from Afghanistan. Was President Biden the responsible agent? No. He gave an order. He said, I want you to get out. Well, then who's responsible? Was it General Milley? Well, General Milley's his senior military advisor and should have warned him after he looked at the plans that he didn't think the plans were very good. And perhaps before we left, we needed to change the plans. But as far as I know, he did no such thing. So his utility to the president as the senior advisor was nil, nothing. So that takes you to General McKenzie, who was the commander of U.S. Central Command, the 4-star Marine. He was responsible. He was the man whose staff planned everything. He picked the commanders, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, Marine commanders, Army commanders, Air Force. Those people were picked. He was the man that formulated the plans. He's the man who was responsible for the debacle. What's happened to him?
Probably a raise or a promotion.
No, he retired. He's on the talk circuit, and I'm sure he'll be given a comfy job in the defense industry or somewhere else so that he can persuade his colleagues on active duty to invest in things that they probably don't need. That's another story. That's a huge problem in Washington, D.C. But the point is, you've got to hold people accountable. If they get it wrong, you get rid of them. And sometimes we found in the past, when Pershing was in command during World War I, Pershing removed or relieved large numbers of general officers. And in fact, he sent them, when he relieved them, to a town in France called Cannes. You've heard of Cannes, where the film festival is? That's where the expression comes from. He got canned. In other words, he was fired. They canned him. The general canned him, sent him to Cannes. So he appointed another general that he knew was a classmate and said, I want you to go there, interview all these people, and tell me if I made a mistake. And out of the 40 or 50 that he interviewed, this general went through and investigated. There were 2 that he came back and he said, these 2 men shouldn't have been relieved. So he said, thank you very much, and reinstated them. The others went away. You've got to do it, even though there's always the potential for a mistake. But you've got to hold people accountable. And there is no accountability in Washington for anything. You started this entire interview with a question. Does anybody in Washington pay attention to the American people? Well, only if they think it's going to help them. If they think by subsidizing something in their district or getting somebody a job who is in their district, or their senators from a state and bring a new defense industry into the state, that's their view of what they're doing to help their friends. But remember, they're helping themselves whenever they do it. There's no such thing as altruistic behavior in Washington. Nobody does anything for nothing. Nobody does anything because they believe in it. I hate to be blunt, but that's been my experience.
Yeah, well, you have a lot more experience in Washington, D.C. than 99% of the people watching this. Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and these updates. I know the people that watch appreciate your time and all the effort you put into staying abreast with everything that's going on. Thank you again for coming on.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you, Steve.
Oh, really quickly, before you have an article coming out in the Conservative. If I can get that in time, I'll put it down below. But just tell us really quickly what that article will be about.
Well, it's in the American Conservative, and it effectively tells the American people what the true state of affairs is in Ukraine. And then it tries to explain that there are plenty of people in Europe who are walking away from this. It's only a matter of time. Orban is no longer alone, and others will follow his example. But we have to understand that our government now faces a very stark choice. Either we admit that Russia has legitimate national security interests in Ukraine, suspend the aid, and set the stage for peace, or we risk being dragged into a regional war. Because once the Russians move, we have no idea how far that will go and what it will cause. We don't want an overreaction. We don't want this thing to widen. That would be a catastrophe. That was Orban's warning from the very beginning. We need to scale it back. We need to contain it, separate ourselves from it, and then ultimately stop it. He was right. That's what we should be doing. This is the last thing that we in the United States and the West need, is a regional war with Russia. Yeah. Especially since we and our European allies are not prepared for it, and the Russians are.
Okay. Yeah, if I can, I'll put that link down below. If not, go search that article. But I'm excited. All the articles that your team has sent me, I have found so insightful. So I wanted to make sure to bring that up before we let you go. Thank you again for coming on, and have a great rest of your day.
Same to you, Steve.